In the late 1950s, the landscape for people struggling with drug addiction was bleak and unforgiving. Rehabilitation programs were scarce, and societal understanding of addiction was limited at best. Into this void stepped Charles "Chuck" Dederich, a man who had himself been shaped by personal battles with alcoholism and the principles of Alcoholics Anonymous. Dederich, believing in the possibility of recovery and transformation, envisioned a program that could help addicts reclaim their lives. It was an ambitious plan, one that began modestly but would eventually grow into a sprawling, controversial, and dangerous movement. Dederich established Synanon in 1958 in Santa Monica, California, with the initial mission of providing a supportive environment for recovering drug addicts. The early days were grounded in the ideals of community, accountability, and rigorous therapy. Members lived together, worked together, and were encouraged to confront their addictions head-on. Central to the program was a confrontational form of group therapy, known later as the game, where participants would face intense scrutiny and criticism from their peers. At first, these sessions were intended to break down the walls of denial and self-deception, forcing individuals to confront the truths they had been avoiding about themselves and their substance use. Many found the experience transformative, and word of the program spread among those seeking recovery. The early philosophy of Synanon was rooted in idealism. Dederich emphasized equality and integration, rejecting the racial and class prejudices that were widespread at the time. Within the walls of Synanon, members of different backgrounds were encouraged to work and live side by side, striving for mutual respect and understanding. This progressive approach attracted attention, and soon the organization began drawing individuals not only struggling with addiction, but also those intrigued by the promise of a more egalitarian communal life. As Synanon grew, so did Dederich's influence. What began as a rehabilitation program slowly morphed into a tightly controlled community. The group constructed businesses, farms, and schools, creating a largely self-sustaining environment. This communal living arrangement, while fostering solidarity, also allowed Dederich to extend his reach into nearly every aspect of members' lives. Decisions that once might have been personal, marriage, family planning, career choices, became subject to his oversight and often his directives. By the late 1960s, the confrontational therapy of the game had intensified. Initially designed as a tool for personal growth, it evolved into a method of asserting authority and enforcing conformity. Members were encouraged to critique one another mercilessly, to reveal every flaw, secret, or failing. Those who resisted were isolated or punished, reinforcing Dederich's centrality and the group's rigid social hierarchy. Over time, the line between therapeutic intervention and coercive control blurred. The culture of accountability that had once been liberating began to feel oppressive. The expansion of Synanon also brought a shift in its demographic composition. While the original population was largely composed of recovering addicts seeking help, Dederich began attracting followers who were drawn less by addiction recovery and more by the communal lifestyle and idealistic vision of a drug-free society. Some were students, professionals, or young people disenchanted with mainstream culture, seeking purpose and belonging. This influx of new members diluted the original rehabilitative focus and allowed Dederich to experiment with broader social control, framing Synanon as not just a treatment center, but a model for an ideal community. Power dynamics within Synanon became increasingly centralized. Dederich, revered as both leader and visionary, exercised absolute authority over members' private lives. He began making extreme demands, including forced vasectomies and abortions for male and female members alike, in what he described as a means of ensuring the integrity and dedication of the community. Women were sometimes required to shave their heads, marriages were dissolved at the leader's discretion, and couples were sometimes rematched to better align with the community's objectives. Dederich's vision of utopia was one in which individuality was subordinated to the collective, and loyalty to him was the ultimate measure of one's worth. Alongside these measures, Synanon cultivated a reputation for strict discipline and punishment. Physical confrontations became increasingly normalized within the community, both in the context of the game and through the enforcement of rules. A paramilitary group, informally known as the Imperial Marines, emerged as an instrument of Dederich's will, tasked with maintaining order and compliance. Their presence created a climate of fear that permeated daily life, ensuring that dissent or criticism of the leadership was rare and often swiftly punished. The organization's legal and public entanglements also grew during this period. As Synanon's influence expanded, its activities began to attract scrutiny from outside authorities. Reports of abuse, coercion, and criminal behavior surfaced, yet the community remained insular and resistant to outside interference. Members were often instructed to view critics as enemies, reinforcing a siege mentality that further solidified Dederich's control. One of the most infamous incidents exemplifying this shift was the attack on attorney Paul Morantz, who had taken legal action against Synanon. Two members placed a rattlesnake in Morantz's mailbox, resulting in a dangerous bite. This act of violence shocked the public and underscored the extent to which Dederich and his followers would go to defend their community and leadership. Despite these transgressions, Synanon continued to present itself outwardly as a philanthropic and progressive organization. Dederich's rhetoric emphasized social equality, rehabilitation, and community building, masking the increasingly authoritarian and abusive practices occurring behind closed doors. The church-like rebranding of Synanon as the Church of Synanon allowed the organization to claim tax-exempt status and further consolidate its influence. For many members, the promise of spiritual growth and personal transformation justified the sacrifices and strictures imposed upon them. Those who questioned the leader or the system often found themselves isolated, punished, or expelled, reinforcing the cycle of control. Children within Synanon were not immune to these dynamics. Raised in the communal environment, they were often subjected to the same ideological indoctrination, rigorous discipline, and surveillance as adult members. Education and daily life were structured to reinforce loyalty to Dederich and adherence to the community's rules. Reports of neglect, emotional manipulation, and even physical abuse surfaced in later accounts from former members, painting a disturbing picture of life inside the walls of the community. Childhood innocence was subordinated to the larger project of creating a disciplined, ideologically aligned society. As the 1970s progressed, cracks in the Synanon facade became increasingly apparent. Former members began to speak out, lawsuits were filed, and investigative journalists exposed elements of the organization's inner workings. The contrast between the original vision of rehabilitation and the reality of coercion, violence, and authoritarianism became undeniable. Legal authorities challenged Synanon's tax-exempt status, criminal charges were pursued, and media coverage brought the community's practices into the national spotlight. Despite attempts to justify or conceal its behavior, the organization's unsustainable and abusive structure could not withstand scrutiny indefinitely. The unraveling of Synanon highlighted the dangers inherent in charismatic, authoritarian leadership, combined with insular communal living. What had begun as a hopeful effort to help addicts reclaim their lives had devolved into a tightly controlled environment where personal freedoms were sacrificed, abuses were normalized, and the cult of personality around Dederich dominated all aspects of life. Former members would later recount the psychological toll, the loss of autonomy, and the pervasive fear that defined their existence within the community. For outsiders, Synanon became a cautionary tale of how good intentions can be corrupted by unchecked power and ideological zeal. Yet, even in its decline, Synanon's legacy persisted. Its innovative approaches to rehabilitation and confrontational therapy influenced later programs, both positively and negatively. The model it established for communal living, intense peer accountability, and strict behavioral regulation found echoes in other therapeutic and institutional settings, sometimes with troubling consequences. Scholars and journalists examining Synanon's history often emphasize the duality of its story. A movement that sought to heal but ultimately inflicted harm, offering lessons about human vulnerability, leadership, and the ethics of control. By the time Synanon officially disbanded in 1991, the community had been thoroughly dismantled, and Charles Dederich's personal influence had waned. Many former members struggled to reintegrate into society, carrying with them the psychological and emotional scars of their years in the organization. Families were fractured, trust had been eroded, and the shadow of the past lingered. Yet some also reflected on the moments of genuine connection, the ideals of equality and support, and the potential for transformation that had initially drawn them to Synanon. These conflicting memories underscore the complexity of a story that is at once inspiring and horrifying. Synanon's trajectory from hopeful rehabilitation program to notorious cult serves as a stark reminder of how power, ideology, and human psychology intersect in complex ways. The story is not just about one man or one organization, but about broader societal challenges, the desperation of addiction, the search for belonging, and the vulnerability of individuals to charismatic leaders and controlling systems. It is a narrative that continues to resonate, particularly in contemporary discussions about rehabilitation, new religious movements, and the ethics of authority. The lessons of Synanon are manifold. They caution against blind obedience and the surrender of personal agency, highlight the importance of oversight and accountability in communal or therapeutic settings, and demonstrate the ease with which noble intentions can be manipulated into oppressive systems. At the same time, the story reflects the enduring human desire for connection, healing, and purpose, a desire that, if guided by wisdom and compassion rather than coercion and fear, can lead to genuine transformation. As observers, historians, and former members recount the tale of Synanon, they reveal a world that was at once hopeful and dangerous. The organization's beginnings, full of idealism and promise, gave way to authoritarianism, coercion, and criminality. The complex interplay of vision, power, and human vulnerability ensures that Synanon's story remains a compelling and cautionary chapter in the history of rehabilitation movements and cult dynamics alike. As Synanon expanded into the 1970s, the utopian vision that had once drawn people in began to crumble under the weight of authoritarian control, escalating abuses, and increasing isolation from the outside world. Charles Dederich's charisma and early idealism had initially inspired loyalty, but with growth came the concentration of power, and the mechanisms he used to maintain that control became more extreme. The game, once a tool for self-reflection and rehabilitation, now operated as a form of psychological discipline that tested not just endurance but obedience. Participants were expected to submit fully to the will of the leader and the consensus of the community, leaving little room for individual judgment or dissent. The group's rigid structure permeated every aspect of daily life. Members' schedules, relationships, and even bodily autonomy were regulated by the dictates of Dederich. Forced medical procedures, including vasectomies for men and abortions for women, became tools to control population and loyalty, framed as measures to protect the integrity of the community. The reshuffling of marriages and relationships, along with enforced head shaving for women, stripped members of personal identity, while signaling complete submission to Dederich's authority. For many, the promise of spiritual enlightenment or community belonging was intertwined with a persistent fear of reprisal if they failed to conform. The Imperial Marines, Synanon's paramilitary enforcers, became a symbol of the community's descent into intimidation and coercion. Their role was not limited to maintaining order within the communal living spaces. They also extended Synanon's influence outward, intimidating critics, lawyers, and journalists who questioned the organization's practices. The most infamous of these incidents involved attorney Paul Morantz, whose legal actions against Synanon provoked a terrifying response. Members placed a live rattlesnake in his mailbox, a calculated act of violence meant to serve as a warning to others who might challenge Dederich's authority. The audacity of such acts shocked the public and underscored the dangerous evolution of what had started as a drug rehabilitation program. Children raised within Synanon were particularly vulnerable to its psychological and social controls. Born into a world governed by rigid rules and ideological conformity, they experienced childhood through the lens of communal indoctrination. Education, play, and family life were structured to reinforce the primacy of the leader's vision. Former members would later describe an environment in which obedience was prioritized over individual growth, and the fear of punishment was ever present. Emotional manipulation, neglect, and in some cases, outright abuse, left deep psychological scars that would persist long after the children left the community. The organization's rhetoric promised a safe and idealistic upbringing, but the reality was often starkly different. Within Synanon, a hierarchy of power emerged that blurred the lines between spiritual guidance, therapeutic authority, and authoritarian control. Senior members, hand-picked by Dederich, acted as intermediaries and enforcers, ensuring that the community adhered strictly to the leader's vision. Peer pressure and public humiliation during the game became tools to maintain conformity, and dissenters were quickly marginalized or expelled. Even those who had initially joined for genuine recovery found themselves enmeshed in a system that demanded total submission. Questions of morality, legality, and personal freedom were subordinated to the community's insular code, creating a climate where abuse could flourish unchecked. The communal economy of Synanon further reinforced dependency on the organization. Members worked in businesses and farms owned by the group, often without standard wages or independent financial control. This economic integration tied members' livelihoods to their continued participation in the community, making departure not only socially but financially challenging. For many, leaving Synanon meant losing not just a home or relationships, but the very means to support oneself. The combination of psychological, social, and economic pressure created an environment in which leaving was daunting, and obedience became a practical necessity as well as a social expectation. Public perception of Synanon began to shift as investigative reporting uncovered the group's practices. Stories of coercion, forced medical procedures, child abuse, and violence painted a grim picture that contrasted sharply with the public image of a progressive rehabilitation program. Lawsuits were filed, and authorities scrutinized the organization's tax-exempt status after its rebranding as the Church of Synanon. Dederich's attempts to defend the organization often involved a mix of charisma, legal maneuvering, and intimidation, but the mounting evidence of abuse and criminal behavior could not be ignored indefinitely. Media coverage brought Synanon's inner workings into the national consciousness, and the once idealistic community became synonymous with cult-like control and danger. Within the community, members' psychological experiences reflected the complex dynamics of control, indoctrination, and fear. Many describe the tension between the initial sense of belonging and the growing awareness of abuse. Cognitive dissonance became a common response, as individuals reconciled their affection for certain aspects of the community with the harsh realities of coercion and manipulation. Former members later recounted the difficulty of leaving, explaining that the organization's influence extended into personal identity, making departure feel like a betrayal of self. The blending of spiritual ideals, therapeutic language, and authoritarian enforcement created a potent system that ensnared the mind as well as the body. As Dederich's influence grew, the organization also sought to manipulate external systems to its advantage. The Church of Synanon claimed tax-exempt status under religious grounds, allowing it to operate with fewer regulatory constraints. Legal battles were frequent, and the organization's responses often involved both legal defense and aggressive intimidation of opponents. The combination of strategic litigation, public relations efforts, and internal control mechanisms enabled Synanon to maintain its operations even in the face of growing scrutiny. Yet each victory reinforced the authoritarian culture within, emboldening Dederich and his inner circle to push boundaries further. Despite the mounting pressure from authorities, critics, and former members, life within Synanon continued for many as a carefully constructed microcosm. Daily routines were regimented, communal labor was mandatory, and participation in the game remained central to social cohesion. Members were encouraged to prioritize the collective over the individual, and obedience to Dederich was framed as a moral and spiritual imperative. For some, the sense of purpose and belonging remained compelling, even as the negative aspects of the community became increasingly apparent. The duality of life within Synanon, hope and fear, empowerment and control, defined the lived experience of its members. By the late 1970s, the escalation of abuse and public scrutiny brought Synanon to a critical point. High-profile legal cases, media exposés, and testimonies from former members revealed the extent of coercion, violence, and manipulation. The organization's claim to be a rehabilitation program was increasingly questioned, and the reality of cult-like control could no longer be concealed. Former members began to speak publicly about the psychological and physical harms they endured, contributing to a growing body of evidence that painted a damning picture of Dederich's leadership and the organization's practices. Synanon's fall from public favor was accelerated by internal fractures. As legal pressures mounted, cracks appeared in the leadership structure, and the unquestioned loyalty that had sustained Dederich began to waver. Some senior members, disillusioned or fearful of legal consequences, distanced themselves from the organization, while others attempted to maintain control through intensified coercion. The paradox of Synanon's situation became evident. The same strategies that had created cohesion and obedience now contributed to instability and exposure. The tightly controlled community, once insulated from criticism, was increasingly vulnerable to collapse. The experiences of children, women, and ordinary members during this period reveal the human cost of authoritarian control cloaked in idealism. Many recounted long-term psychological trauma, including anxiety, depression, and difficulties with trust and autonomy. Relationships that had been constructed within the framework of Dederich's authority often fractured when individuals left the community, leaving emotional scars and disrupted family ties. Yet amidst the suffering, there were also accounts of genuine friendships, moments of care, and periods of personal growth that some attributed to the supportive aspects of communal living. These complex narratives illustrate the duality of Synanon, a place of potential healing that became a site of exploitation and abuse. Even as the organization faced increasing scrutiny, Dederich remained a commanding presence. His public persona, coupled with legal maneuvering and media strategies, enabled him to project control beyond the immediate confines of Synanon. Yet the internal culture of fear, obedience, and intimidation could not fully withstand the combined pressure of investigative reporting, legal accountability, and the testimonies of former members. Each exposure, lawsuit, and news story chipped away at the facade of legitimacy, revealing the darker realities of the organization's operations and the human suffering it engendered. By the early 1980s, Synanon's legal troubles escalated further. Authorities investigated allegations ranging from fraud to physical abuse and intimidation tactics. The organization's attempts to defend itself legally were often entangled with continued coercion of members, further blurring the line between legitimate defense and abuse. Public perception shifted decisively. As former members, accounts provided a window into the oppressive environment that had long been hidden behind the rhetoric of rehabilitation and communal living. The once idealistic organization was now widely recognized as a dangerous cult, its abuses and extremism overshadowing any prior accomplishments. The collapse of Synanon was not abrupt but gradual, marked by legal defeats, defections of senior members, and the erosion of the community's cohesion. The infrastructure of communal living, once a source of unity and self-sufficiency, began to falter. Members left or were expelled, businesses and farms faced operational challenges, and the internal enforcement mechanisms lost their effectiveness. Dederich's authority, so long absolute, was increasingly symbolic rather than practical. By the time the organization officially disbanded in 1991, Synanon had transitioned from a powerful social and therapeutic experiment into a cautionary tale of leadership gone awry, communal idealism corrupted, and human vulnerability exploited. Even after disbandment, the legacy of Synanon persisted. Former members struggled with the long-term effects of trauma, disrupted relationships, and the challenge of reintegrating into society. The organization's history became a subject of study for sociologists, psychologists, and historians interested in cult dynamics, communal living, and the ethics of rehabilitation. Synanon's methods, particularly its confrontational therapy, continued to influence subsequent therapeutic and institutional programs, both as a model and as a warning. The story of Synanon endures as a complex intersection of idealism, power, coercion, and human resilience. By the mid-1980s, Synanon was no longer the hopeful rehabilitation program it had once promised to be. The organization, once celebrated for its unconventional yet seemingly progressive methods of drug recovery, had become synonymous with coercion, manipulation, and violence. Charles "Chuck" Dederich, whose charisma had initially inspired admiration and loyalty, had become a symbol of absolute authority. His vision of a utopian communal society was now inseparable from fear, intimidation, and the exploitation of those who had entrusted their lives to the organization. The legal landscape surrounding Synanon had tightened considerably. Multiple lawsuits had been filed against the organization for fraud, abuse, and intimidation. Former members, emboldened by the growing media attention, came forward to share harrowing accounts of life within the community. Their testimonies detailed coerced medical procedures, psychological manipulation, marital control, and the pervasive threat of violence. The attack on attorney Paul Morantz, once a shocking anecdote of the organization's extremity, now seemed emblematic of Synanon's readiness to defend its leadership through dangerous means. Law enforcement began to take a closer look at the organization, and the combination of internal dissent and external pressure marked the beginning of Synanon's unraveling. As the organization faced mounting scrutiny, the internal dynamics of the community shifted. Some senior members, once complicit in enforcing Dederich's directives, began to question the morality and legality of their actions. Their hesitations weakened the mechanisms of control, allowing others to challenge the rigid rules and rigid social hierarchy that had dominated life within Synanon. The game, which had served as both a therapeutic tool and a method of social enforcement, became a site of tension. While some members continued to participate out of fear or obligation, others began resisting the emotional and psychological pressure it imposed. The cracks in the carefully constructed social order became increasingly visible. Children and young adults, raised entirely within the Synanon environment, faced a particular crisis. For many, their identities, socialization, and understanding of normalcy had been shaped by the doctrines and practices of the organization. Leaving Synanon meant confronting a world that was, in many ways, alien and unwelcoming. Former members would later recount difficulties in forming relationships, trusting authority, and navigating the ordinary social structures of society. The psychological impact of growing up under strict surveillance, ideological indoctrination, and frequent coercion could not be overstated. Many required years of therapy and support to reclaim a sense of autonomy and self-worth. The economic model of Synanon, which had bound members to the organization through work and communal responsibility, also began to falter. Businesses that had once generated revenue to sustain the community struggled amid legal battles, defections, and public exposure. Farms, schools, and other communal enterprises were increasingly unsustainable, leaving members without both income and the structure that had defined their daily lives. Financial dependence, once a tool of control, became a source of instability, accelerating the exodus of those who had initially been reluctant to leave. By the late 1980s, Dederich's authority was increasingly symbolic rather than practical. Defections, public scrutiny, and legal consequences eroded the infrastructure of power that had supported his absolute control. Members who had long endured coercion and manipulation began reclaiming agency, leaving Synanon in search of freedom and normalcy. The organization's once rigid hierarchy crumbled as defections multiplied, and the mechanisms of fear lost their effectiveness. What had seemed invincible during the organization's peak now appeared vulnerable and fragmented. The disbandment of Synanon in 1991 marked the end of an era, but it did not erase the legacy of its influence. Former members were left to navigate the complex aftermath of their experiences, confronting trauma, fractured relationships, and challenges of reintegration into society. The psychological and emotional scars were profound. As many struggled to reconcile the idealism that had initially drawn them with the abuses and coercion that had defined the later years of the organization. Support networks, therapy, and personal resilience became crucial for those attempting to rebuild their lives. Yet even amid this pain, some individuals reflected on positive aspects of their experiences. The sense of community, the emphasis on equality and integration, and moments of genuine connection provided a complicated memory landscape. For many, Synanon represented both a space of opportunity and a site of profound harm. These dualities underscore the complexity of the organization's history and its impact on the lives of individuals who lived within its confines. Historians, psychologists, and sociologists have studied Synanon extensively as a case study in cult dynamics, communal living, and the ethics of rehabilitation. Its trajectory from hopeful intervention to authoritarian cult offers lessons about the interplay of charismatic leadership, social isolation, and human vulnerability. The organization's rise and fall illustrate how good intentions, when combined with unchecked authority and insular community structures, can lead to systematic abuse. Synanon's methods, particularly the confrontational therapy that formed its core, influenced subsequent programs and interventions, both positively in terms of structured accountability and negatively in terms of coercive control. The cultural impact of Synanon extends beyond its immediate membership. Its history has been explored in books, documentaries, and academic studies, providing insight into the mechanics of control, psychological manipulation, and the vulnerabilities of individuals seeking support. The story of Synanon remains a cautionary tale about the potential dangers of charismatic leadership and the importance of oversight, transparency, and ethical responsibility in therapeutic and communal settings. Its narrative serves as both a historical record and a warning for contemporary movements.